Hi guys, Artiar here. So for this video will be the Divinate tier list for 3.4.13. Because the previous Divinate tier list is like on May, and which is like kind of like 5 months ago already. So some players actually comment and asking for updated Divinate tier list because we have some Esper balance changes, we have new Esper came out, and then this video here is more focused on PvE Divinate tier list. So this tier list here will base on PvE content only. And this PvE content is only including the bossing content and also all those high score content and speed run. So it's more towards into the very end game of like the miracle challenges for the PvE. Because if you want to clear all PvE content in Dislyte, like the tower content, all those things, Divinate is not a must, right? You can, as long as you have the certain Esper, equipment is more important than Divinate in a way to clear the Dislyte content. But this tier list here is more focused on the PvE content that is on the end game, that you are chasing for speed run, that you are chasing for getting more high score in Falsetto Fantasy, getting more high score in like Desolate Land, so you have higher ranking for the Miracle Challenge. So then Divinate matters because it increases your stats, it gives you bonus effect, all those stuff, so it will affect that kind of content. Okay, so this video here, the tier here will separate into a few ways. This is the highest value, so I would say if I put the Esper here, their Divinate actually boost your PvE content at the highest value. Then the more the better, which means you can go, I would recommend you to go up higher than D3 because the stats boost from the Divinate actually matters. Then D3 here is mostly because of the Divinate will provide a certain effect to the Esper, so it will make the Esper strong. So for example, Eugene here is definitely going to be a D3 Esper. Then Decent here, I would say that with or without the Divinate will also benefit the Esper. Then I would say skippable is like the Esper doesn't really perform in PvE, and then so having the Divinate or not having the Divinate, it doesn't really matter too much in PvE content at end game. Although scoring content, it doesn't really matter too much. Then don't equip here, there's only one specific Esper, and it's gonna be Yun Chuan. I'm gonna straight away include it here because Yun Chuan Divinate will provide attack up at the start of the combat, and this thing here will break your Falsetto Fantasy team comp if you are playing with the old Yun Chuan, Embla, Fushi, all those teams, because Yun Chuan might steal the like Haley buff or Liam buff from Embla because Yun Chuan have a higher attack. But if you don't care about that anymore, if your Falsetto Fantasy no longer running that team, then maybe your Yun Chuan can like maybe go to D3 or the more the better, or else he will be the only Esper that I'll recommend don't equip his Divinate. Alright, then the first first Esper we're gonna go through is gonna be Sakura. So Sakura in PvE content, Rezo and equipment is not more important for her. So the Divinate on her, I would say, is skippable for PvE content. It's like she doesn't really need the Divinate in my opinion. Then Lu Shang here, I would say is decent. Like the skill cooldown on the Lu Shang Divinate is pretty good, but it's not that important as well. Like if you have it, then it's good, but not really needed for D3 as well in my opinion. Then Chu Yao here, I would say is skippable because the damage taken in combat is more towards PvP. PvE wise doesn't really important. Then Sujie I would say is the highest value because Sujie can be used in a lot of PvE content, especially in like bosses content as well. And Sujie's Divinate, the stats boost especially comes in very handy. So I would say it's the highest value for Sujie. I would definitely go for D6 for Sujie. Even like the current meta now, I would still recommend her to go D6. Then for Eugene here, definitely is a D3 because her Divinate here goes until D3. The 100% chance trigger is very important. So you don't want to go through the RNG layer like 50% or 75%. So you want to try to make her 100% very consistent. So definitely is a D3. But after you hit D3, to be honest, the stats doesn't matter too much. Then for the Yamato healing part, right, like D3 is not really needed, to be honest. I would say it's decent. Like if you have it, then fine, just equip on it. It will benefit for your combat, but it's not like a must thing or not a very high Divinate requirement in my opinion, so I won't say it's going to be that important. Same for Feng Shun. Okay, Feng Shun I would say the more the better is because the skill effect on Divinate doesn't matter too much in PvE. Like D2 is pretty good for Feng Shui to stop, but the more stats Feng Shui is, the more Feng Shui is gonna perform better, because Feng Shui can be a sub DPS and be a main DPS for Shadow Gale, if not mistaken. Is it Gale or Stream? I forgot. Basically, Feng Shui can be performing there, and the stats for Feng Shui is actually pretty solid as well. Like the HP scaling damage and attack scaling damage also very handy. So I'll say the more the better, but doesn't really needed to go until D6 if we have to compare Suje and Feng Shui's value. Then for Yuhime part here, Yuhime doesn't really use in bossing content. Yuhime is more towards like maybe you're gonna use her in PvE, it's like tower content, all those things. So I would say Yuhime's Divinate is skippable. It's not very important in the PvE bossing content. Then Mavis here, I would say is skippable as well, not really that important. And when you reach into end game, even in speed run, right, you won't be using Mavis at all. So I would say is skippable. Then for Jinchu here, I would say is decent. Like the damage output from this Jinchu is pretty solid for Andras. Not really for speed running, but I would say it's still a decent choice for Jinchu to have his Divinate in end game PvE content. Then for Lucas here, skippable. Doesn't really matter for PvE. Tricky as well, skippable. Clara here, I would say is gonna be at decent. If you can actually go for D3, but the reason why I would say it's decent is like the Clara, another extra dispel from her kit is pretty good, but the only part that you use Clara is gonna be the shadow bosses. The Inferno one, the shadow bosses. Clara, the Divinate Dispel is actually very good, because the faster or the more debuff you can cleanse from within the time limit, then you can hit the multiplier times 18 for the shadow boss. So I would say that Clara's Divinate, I would also want her Divinate, but I won't actively push her to D3. I don't think her priority is that high. I would say that if I get it naturally from Go Record, it will be good, but I won't actively go for it. So I would say it's decent for Clara. Then for Momo in PvE content, I would say is decent as well, because the only content you use Momo for PvE endgame content is going to be Dark Starlord. But other than that, it doesn't really matter. But Momo Divinate here also coming handy for the attack up to increase a little bit more DPS, and her stats boost increase. The DPS is also pretty nice as well. But I won't say it's like until that important on the tier here. Then Phantom Sister one, I would say is decent as well. Like the effect buff from Phantom Sister is pretty good, but I won't say it's that important. Meta Lily here, I would say the more the better. But Meta Lily, the more the better is only if you are using Meta Lily in your bossing content. If you are using Meta Lily in your bossing content, of course the Divinate is the more the better. But if you don't use Meta Lily at all, the Divinate doesn't really matter at all, because this is about their priority. If you're using them, then how high is their priority of getting the Divinate? Then for Gabby here in PvE, I would say is skippable. Abigail here, I would say is skippable. Or maybe I'll put Abigail like one tier higher, because of her CD reduction on her Divinate is pretty solid if you're using Abigail in Shadowfire or your Falsetto Fantasy bossing content. I would say that it's pretty good, but it's not really that important. Same for Sally, I would say is skippable. Lian, the immunity here can be skippable. Liam here, instantly the highest value. She is one of the main DPS for your Sonica boss, and one of the best sub DPS and support for the other bosses, including Shadowfire as well. So definitely the highest value for Liam Divinate. Then for Nora one, I would say is decent, or the more the better. I would push it at the more the better, because Nora not just using in shadow bosses, can be also used in Falsetto Fantasy. It's pretty strong, and Nora can be also used for Andras as well. One of my older video, like doing Andras like 10 turn or somewhere there, Nora is one of the main DPS, so the higher the Divinate, the better she is. It's a pretty solid choice that can be used in all three endgame PvE content. Then for Ethan here, skippable. Amir here, I would say the more the better, but not really that needed. Let me think. Cause the bossing content, speedrun, Fafnir. Okay, I'll say decent for Amir. Like the speedrun content for Armir is gonna be Fafnir, but to be honest, without Armir's Divinate, will also finish the speedrun pretty solid. As long as your Mateo or the other Esper have high Divinate, it will cover up Armir's Divinate's value. So I would say decent. I don't think it's that important or should actively go for. Genie is skippable. Feng Shun is Fushi is gonna be D3 because the defend up buff for Feng Shun for Fushi to cast his S3 before casting S3 get a defend up buff is pretty solid to increase his DPS, especially when you're using Fushi and Embla in Falsetto Fantasy. The defend up will increase his DPS by a lot. Okay, then for Farah here, I would say skippable, not really in bossing content as well. Embla, I would say the highest value as well. Maybe you can debate like Embla would drop by 1 tier, but I would still say Embla is one of the highest value Divinate. She's still very used in bossing content, even though she's slightly dropping off now compared to the other new DPS we have. Like after 1 year plus release, she's finally dropping off, but I still think her Divinate is still one of the best in the game for PvE content, so I will still put the highest value. Hilda here, the Divinate value I would say is skippable. Skippable, TA here skippable. Sienna here, Sienna Divinate is Dispel, right? So I would say skippable, doesn't really matters in PvE content. Hype skippable, Elite skippable, Changji skippable, all this is so all this skippable is why am I going through so fast is because they are not really using in the end game content for PvE, so that Divinate value for end game PvE isn't that important as well. But if you get it from Go Record, definitely just get it. It's a free Divinate anyway. Then for Ollie for one, I would say the more the better. Why I put Ollie this high is because I know that Ollie, the other PvE content is not running Ollie at all, right? But Ollie is only doing one job, which is in Chronos. So if you are using Ollie in Chronos, his Divinate is very important. Like the attack up buff for him and the stats boost for him as going for a Chronos speedrun, Ollie is your core Esper to deal DPS. But if you don't care about Chronos speedrun, Ollie's Divinate will be skippable. But if you care about Chronos speedrun and you care about Miracle Challenge and you are trying to push Chronos Miracle Challenge, I would say the more the better. So this is the criteria that I'm judging, right? But Ollie here, maybe it's debatable. You want to put here as skippable, but personally, I really like Ollie's Divinate just because of Chronos speedrun, and he cannot be replaced. At least so far, I don't see any team that can actually replace Ollie as a speedrunner in Chronos. Okay, then for Gaius here, Divinate for endgame PvE, I would say skippable. Intisa skippable, JV skippable, all this skippable. Leora one I would say is decent, just because of Chronos speedrun, but I would say overall it's still decent. Brewster here, I would say the more the better. All bossing content. Shadowfire not really. I mean the shadow bosses not really, but Falsetto Fantasy all 3 bosses is very important. The Apex one is also very important. The more Divinate you have, the better Brewster is. But I would say Brewster is no longer the highest value because like getting D3 is actually is enough. But of course, the more stats is better. But I don't think Brewster is that universal until the highest value here. So I would say the more the better. But I would say I would debate between highest value and the more the better for Brewster. Then Biotina skip, Ashley skip, Mateo here, the more the better as well. Cause Mateo speedrun for Fafnir, for all Falsetto Fantasy bosses, and also for Shadow bosses as well. Mateo is still one of the best DPS output for a wind type Esper. Then for Elaine here, I would say decent. Doesn't need until D3, but if you get the Divinate, it will benefit for Elaine. Then for Yuran here, I would say it's skippable. Elif here, definitely the highest value, but Elif have to be R6. If your Elif is not R6, the Divinate doesn't matter for her. Okay? So, but if you have Elif R6, the Divinate definitely is the highest value. Then for Haley, Divinate skippable, Liling Swan skippable, all this skippable. Slot is the highest value for her Divinate cause of all Falsetto Fantasy bosses. and shadow bosses as well, and chronos as well. Like if you have Slon, then what's that called? Leora's Divinate isn't that important, but if you don't have Slon, then Leora's Divinate value will be that important. But I won't actively chase for her her Divinate. Then for Ife 1, skippable. Osana 1, I would say is skippable. Nama 1, I would say is D3, because the D3 effect, a tap up, is very important for Nama. If you're using Nama for speed running for APAP, and Andras is going to be very, very important for Nama's Divinate. Like getting Nama D3 or without D3 actually matters the whole run. Then of Ophelia Divinate here, I would say that is the more the better, because Ophelia Divinate effect is very strong, especially for Andras and the other bosses content as well. Shadow bosses one doesn't really matter, but the stats boost for Ophelia is also very strong, because Ophelia now can be used in Fafnir, Andras, Versatile Fantasy bosses if you're really lacking of DPS but not really, and Shadow bosses can be using Ophelia as well. So I would say the more the better. Her value for it is actually very high. Then for Valeria 1, I would say the more the better as well. She's one of the best DPS for Shadow Fire boss, and one of the best for Chronos as well if you're not really going for speed run, but her DPS is still pretty handy. And also for Versatile Fantasy, she can be one of your DPS as well if you don't have other Esper. So I would say Valeria is also the more the better here. Then this one here, I would say skippable, 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 skippable. This is for the legendary Esper one. Then now we are going through is the Shimmer Esper one. That Shimmer Esper here, the Una's Divinate doesn't really matter because the immunity at the start is more towards to PvP. Cecilia doesn't matter. Raven here, I would say the more the better, especially you're going for a speed run in all the ritual bosses. Raven actually come in very, very handy. Taver one, it really depends on do you use Taver for your content, right? But for Taver, I would say it's decent. Unless your Taver is at R6, then it's the highest value. If your Taver is R6, that is the highest value. But if your Taver is not R6, which is I think 99% of us, Taver is not R6, so I would say Taver is decent because there's a lot of other replacement for Taver now as a DPS role, right? Like you see all the top Esper Divinate here, they are more important as a DPS. So I would say Taver Divinate value is not that high. But of course in Shadow Glow, Taver's Divinate is still there, the value. But overall, like even though it's R2 Taver, I wouldn't say his value is that high anymore. Then Nusi one, I would say skippable, Petro skippable, these are all skippable because they are PvP Esper. Anna one, I would say D3 or the more the better, because I know some players still using Anna at Versatile Fantasy bosses. It's pretty solid a DPS that provides immunity. So overall, I would still say the more the better, but to be honest, it's not really that high tier already. I would say it's D3, just for the healing effect. Okay, then the next one is gonna be 𝐃𝐈. Let me slightly screw it away. Okay, the next one is gonna be 𝐃𝐈. I think it's skippable because her value for the Divinate doesn't really matter too much in PvE content. Like the heal, that's just increase the healing. Then Moriyama one, I would say is decent. Doesn't really matter too much because alright, let me rescale it for a while. Alright, so Moriyama one, I would say is decent. Like having Moriyama's Divinate is pretty good, but depends on if you're using Moriyama in the PvE content. I know some players using Moriyama as their speed run content for Chronos, APAP, Fafnir, I believe, and I saw player using Moriyama as their speed runner because the 5 hit is pretty strong. So I would say it's decent. But personally, I don't use Moriyama at all. But I see player use it, so I would put him decent, or else I would actually put him as skippable. Then for Wuyu here, I would say is skippable or decent, but it's I would say it's skippable because PvE content. If I really want to compare Moriyama's value and Wuyu's value in the end game, Moriyama's value maybe is slightly higher. Then for why Donna is here as Shimmer? Donna here I would say is skippable. Doesn't really matter for PvE. Iki one is also skippable. Then for Shenpin here, I would say is the more the better, or I would say the more the better. Why Shenpin's Divinate is the more the better, even though she's not a DPS? Because She's a shimmer, and she's still one of the top tier buffer Esper we have. So let's say in all shadow bosses, you're gonna see Champagne. And then Champagne's Divinate effect that give one random ally another stack of soldier. It actually matters a lot because it rotates the soldier rotation a lot more faster to upgrade to chariot. And then the stats boost for Champagne is also very handy. So if you are an endgame PvE player that is actually trying to speedrun a miracle challenge, you'll notice that Champagne's DPS is very important. Like sometimes you're gonna rely on Champagne's S3 to specifically kill a wave of mob that requires her to be DPS, and making her DPS, if you don't have a Divinate, actually the stats is very hard to make her able to clear one wave. That's one thing. And another shadow bosses, like in shadow bosses DPS states, when you're counting DPS, every single DPS counts, and Champagne being one of the mainly used Esper that for Sato Fantasy bosses, speed runs, and also shadow bosses, every DPS or every attack actually matters. So I would say the more the better for Champagne. Okay, so basically this is the conclusion for my own tier for PvE priority endgame. So more focus on speed run and also bossing content as well. Right, if you have which part you don't agree with, or which Esper you think that they needed higher tier, or they are not worth on that tier, they should be lower down, you can also feel free to comment down and let me know as well, because it's been since 5 months I updated this Divinate tier list. I think this one here is pretty accurate to myself. Like for me as an endgame PvE player, for all those speedrun and bossing content, this will be the Divinate tier list that I'm going for. This is purely for PvE, and the PvP one will be coming tomorrow. Okay, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and see you guys in the next video. Bye bye. Special thanks for the direct support on the YouTube membership. So for the benefactor of Artiar, which is 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐈𝐍𝐀𝐓𝐄, thank you so much for your support. And for the supporter and patron of Artiar, which is Divinate, 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐈𝐍𝐀𝐓𝐄, Wang Tamer, Ziggy, Kamaruki, Sunwatts, Rimu, Chani, Von Hexa, Antonio Winterspoon, Marlene Williams, Uncle Chat, Eric Mendes, Craigrin, Riku, Fred X Iris, Calamity, Jordan Elons, Rocco Standions, thank you so much for your support. And that's not all. Also special thanks for the direct support on the live stream super chat for the latest tag. So special thanks to Ziggy, Calamity, Acne, Love Fatima Little Underwear, Bloods, Riku, Fred, Johnny. Thank you so much for your support. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and see you guys in the next video. Bye bye.